A lie can survive for years, but it only takes one ledger to bury it. That was the sentence running through my mind as my wife lifted her champagne glass high enough for everyone in the room to see the diamond bracelet I had quietly paid for 3 Christmases ago. 15 years of marriage had led us to that ballroom overlooking the Chicago River, where soft jazz floated through crystal chandeliers and every smile seemed polished for photographs. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, and even a few members of Melissa's executive team filled the room, celebrating what was supposed to be our anniversary dinner. She looked stunning in a navy designer dress, confident as always, soaking in every compliment that came her way. I adjusted the cuff of my charcoal suit and watched her laugh with the ease of someone who believed she owned the room. Then she tapped her glass with a silver spoon. The conversations faded. Every head turned toward her. "Before we celebrate," she said with a playful grin, "I'd like to thank myself for keeping this family running all these years." A wave of polite laughter drifted across the tables. She continued before anyone could speak. "Some women marry providers. I married a very expensive dependent." The laughter grew louder. "Daniel has always had dreams," she added with a shrug. "Fortunately, somebody had to earn a real paycheck." Even people who barely knew us smiled awkwardly, assuming it was harmless teasing between a husband and wife. I looked around the room. A few guests glanced at me, waiting for a clever comeback. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Melissa's vice president nearly spilled his drink because he was laughing so hard. Her younger sister clapped once against the table. Someone near the back whispered, "She's brutal." Melissa raised her glass again. "To every hardworking woman carrying dead weight at home." Glasses lifted around the ballroom. I kept mine on the table. My heartbeat stayed slow. Funny thing about humiliation is that it doesn't always arrive like a punch. Sometimes it settles over your shoulders like a winter coat you never asked to wear. Heavy, quiet, impossible to ignore. I didn't stand. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. People expect anger from a man who has just been embarrassed in front of 80 guests. Anger gives the crowd another show. Silence makes them uncomfortable. So I chose silence. Melissa looked toward me with the same practiced smile she used in magazine interviews and charity galas. "Come on, honey," she teased. "At least pretend you're contributing tonight." More laughter. I smiled back, not because the joke was funny, but because I had finally stopped expecting fairness from someone who had spent years rewriting our story. If you had asked anyone in that room who paid the mortgage, they would have answered Melissa. If you had asked who covered our health insurance, our property taxes, our vacations, our car payments, or the tuition for her MBA, they would have answered Melissa again. She had repeated that version of our marriage so often that even she seemed to believe it. Truth has an odd habit of disappearing when the lie is more entertaining. I wasn't unemployed. I wasn't retired. I owned a financial consulting firm that almost nobody recognized because my clients signed confidentiality agreements stronger than most marriages. My office occupied the quiet 8th floor of a plain brick building 30 miles outside downtown. No flashy logo. No television interviews. No social media. Just numbers, audits, compliance reports, and businesses that preferred staying invisible. My income never arrived with applause. It arrived through wire transfers, quarterly distributions, and tax documents. Melissa hated that about me. She once told me that invisible success looked too much like failure. I laughed back then. Looking across that ballroom now, I realized she had never been joking. Over the past 3 years, she had slowly built another version of me for everyone else to believe. At neighborhood barbecues, she joked that I worked whenever inspiration struck. During holiday dinners, she called me the world's most expensive house guest. At her office events, she introduced me as my supportive husband with plenty of free time. Every joke landed because I never corrected her. Not because I was weak. Because I thought protecting my wife mattered more than protecting my pride. Tonight felt different. Tonight the performance had become the truth. Melissa stepped down from the small stage while guests surrounded her with congratulations. Someone slapped me gently on the shoulder. "You've got yourself one incredible woman," he said. "Don't let her work too hard supporting you." I smiled politely. "I'll keep that in mind." Across the room, I noticed a familiar face entering through the ballroom doors carrying a slim black leather portfolio. Robert Whitman moved with the calm confidence of a man who had spent 40 years letting numbers speak louder than opinions. He caught my eye for only a second before giving the smallest nod imaginable. Nobody else recognized him. To everyone else, he was simply another older gentleman arriving a little late. To me, he was the accountant who had documented every dollar of my adult life. Every paycheck, every mortgage payment, every investment, every tuition check, every anniversary gift, every tax return, every sacrifice that had quietly built the life Melissa was standing inside, while telling the world she built it alone. I reached into my jacket pocket, felt the folded note I had written that afternoon, and took one slow breath. Then, without raising my voice, without changing my expression, I looked directly at Robert and said the only 7 words that mattered. "Robert, did you bring the complete records with you?" Robert stopped beside my table and rested the black leather portfolio against his leg without saying a word. He had always believed that numbers deserved patience, and after working together for almost 18 years, I had learned the same lesson. Melissa glanced toward him with polite confusion before returning her attention to the guests gathered around her. She assumed he was another business contact stopping by to congratulate us. She had no idea she had met him twice before and forgotten him both times because he never cared about expensive suits or impressive titles. Robert preferred quiet offices, black coffee, and spreadsheets that balanced to the penny. He smiled at me with the same calm expression he wore every April when we finalized. "Tax filings." "Good evening, Daniel," he said. "I brought everything you requested." His voice was steady enough to disappear beneath the music, but the words landed like a key turning inside a lock. Melissa laughed softly. "Daniel, please tell me you are not asking your accountant to rescue your pride." A few people nearby chuckled again. "This is supposed to be an anniversary party, not a tax seminar." I looked at her and answered as calmly as I had answered every difficult conversation during our marriage. "No, Melissa, it is still our anniversary party." I paused just long enough for the room to settle. I simply believe anniversaries should celebrate the truth. The smile on her face tightened for the first time that evening. It lasted only a second before she recovered. Melissa had spent years mastering the expression executives use when meetings take an unexpected turn. She folded her arms and tilted her head. "Well, everyone already knows the truth." That sentence lingered in the air while I remembered how we had arrived here. 15 years earlier, we had stood inside a small church outside Naperville promising to build a life together. Back then, we split every restaurant bill because neither of us earned much. I still remember carrying secondhand furniture into our first apartment and laughing because the dining table leaned slightly to one side. Melissa studied late into the night for professional certifications, while I worked long consulting hours that often stretched past midnight. When she wanted to pursue her Master of Business Administration degree, we sat at that crooked table and agreed she should focus on school while I expanded my client list. We called it an investment in our future. I never called it a sacrifice because marriage was never supposed to be a scoreboard. The tuition payments came from my business account. The student loan she worried about disappeared because I paid it off before interest could grow. When she received her first executive promotion, she thanked everyone from her mentors to the office receptionist during the celebration dinner. She forgot to mention the person who quietly mailed every tuition check. I told myself, it did not matter. Success changes people in small ways before it changes them in obvious ones. At first, Melissa joked that she made more than I did. Then the jokes became stories. The stories became facts. Eventually, those facts became the version of our marriage she repeated everywhere we went. I noticed neighbors beginning to thank her for taking care of Daniel. Friends started asking whether I planned to work full-time again. Even her parents began slipping comments into holiday conversations about how fortunate I was to have such an ambitious wife. Every time I considered correcting them, Melissa squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "Please do not embarrass me." So I stayed quiet. Silence became easier than arguing with a lie that kept growing larger every year. Robert slowly unlatched the portfolio and removed several neatly organized folders separated by colored tabs. Blue for tax returns, green for mortgage records, gold for investment distributions, white for household expenses. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just paper. Funny how ordinary paper can outweigh years of carefully polished stories. Melissa noticed the labels and gave a nervous laugh. "Daniel, this is becoming ridiculous." I met her eyes. "Is it?" She looked toward the guests as if expecting someone else to rescue the conversation. Nobody spoke. Even the jazz trio seemed quieter now. Robert adjusted his glasses before speaking. "I apologize for arriving during your celebration," he said politely. "I was asked to verify financial records if questions about household support came up this evening." Melissa blinked. "Household support?" she repeated. Robert nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." She forced another smile. "There is nothing to verify. Everyone here knows I've been supporting our family for years." Robert did not argue. He simply rested one hand on the first folder. "That is exactly why I brought the documentation." For the first time all night, I saw uncertainty replace confidence in Melissa's eyes. She looked around the ballroom searching for familiar faces, but nobody was laughing anymore. The room had become unusually still, the way a lake grows perfectly smooth. Before dawn, people who had spent the evening enjoying another harmless joke suddenly realized they might have been listening to something else entirely. Robert opened the first folder, glanced toward me for silent confirmation, and I gave him a single nod. He cleared his throat gently, lifted the first page, and prepared to let 15 years of ordinary numbers tell a story that neither emotion nor memory could ever rewrite. Robert lowered his eyes to the first page as if he were about to begin another routine financial review, instead of quietly dismantling a story that had been repeated for years. "For the sake of accuracy," he said, "I will limit myself to documented records. Opinions are not my profession. Numbers are." Nobody interrupted him. Even the servers who had been moving through the ballroom with trays of coffee and dessert slowed their pace. Melissa folded her arms tighter across her chest. "This is unnecessary," she said. "Everyone knows how our finances work." Robert acknowledged her with a polite nod. "That is exactly why documentation exists. Memory changes. Records do not." He placed the first statement on the table where several guests closest to us could see it. "The mortgage on the Carter residence has been paid from the same business account for the past 14 years and 8 months. He read the routing information, the payment schedule, and the annual totals with the calm rhythm of someone describing tomorrow's weather. No drama, no emotion, just facts. I watched several people exchange uncertain looks. Melissa opened her mouth as if to object, but Robert had already moved to the second page. Property taxes were paid from the identical account. Homeowners insurance was automatically withdrawn from the identical account. Major renovations completed 3 years ago, including the kitchen and roof replacement, were funded through the identical account. Melissa laughed once, but the sound landed awkwardly in the silent room. "Daniel probably transferred money into our joint account. That does not prove anything." Robert smiled politely. "Actually, it does. The joint account was used primarily for groceries and routine household purchases. Large financial obligations originated elsewhere." He turned another page. "Vehicle financing for both automobiles. Paid by Mr. Carter's business account. Health insurance premiums for both spouses. Paid by Mr. Carter's business account. Utility expenses exceeding the joint account balance. Covered by Mr. Carter's business account." I noticed Melissa's younger sister slowly lowering her wine glass without taking another sip. Her father stared toward the paperwork instead of at me. Her vice president no longer looked amused. The room had quietly stopped searching for entertainment and started searching for answers. Robert continued without changing his tone. 5 years ago, Mrs. Carter completed her Master of Business Administration degree. He reached into another folder and removed several older records. Tuition payments totaling $112,400 were issued directly from Mr. Carter's consulting firm over a period of 26 months. Melissa's face lost a little color. "That cannot be right." Robert slid copies across the table. "Each payment includes confirmation numbers, university receipts, and canceled checks." She stepped closer and looked down at the documents. For a moment, she said nothing. I remembered those nights more clearly than she probably did. I remembered waiting in my office until almost midnight finishing compliance reports for manufacturing clients because every additional contract meant another tuition payment covered without borrowing money. I remembered bringing dinner home while she studied for final exams, telling her she should focus on graduating instead of worrying about bills. I never asked for credit because I believed one spouse succeeding meant both of us succeeded. Somewhere along the way, that belief became one-sided. Robert turned another page. Educational loans previously associated with Mrs. Carter's graduate program were satisfied in full approximately 8 months after graduation. Melissa looked confused. I thought those loans were refinanced. Robert answered gently. No, ma'am. They were paid in full. She looked at me for the first time that evening without confidence. You never told me. I met her eyes. You never asked. The words were not angry. They simply existed between us like another financial statement. She searched my face as though hoping to find resentment. Instead, she found something much quieter. Exhaustion. Years of explaining nothing had finally reached their limit. Robert continued. May I proceed? I nodded once. He removed another folder labeled Family Expenses. Private health insurance for Mrs. Carter's parents during the 18 months following Mr. Harold Benson's retirement was funded by Mr. Carter after their previous coverage expired. Melissa blinked rapidly. Her father looked toward me with visible surprise. Daniel, he whispered, you were paying that. I gave a small nod. I asked the insurance company not to mention my name. Harold leaned back into his chair as though the weight of that sentence had settled across his shoulders. Melissa looked from her father to me and then back to the paperwork. The picture she had painted for everyone over the years had started developing cracks she could no longer smooth over with another joke. Robert closed one folder and opened the last stack resting inside the portfolio. Everything discussed so far concerns routine household obligations, he said. The remaining documents explain how Mrs. Carter's executive lifestyle was financed during the years her compensation had not yet reached its current level. The silence that followed felt even heavier than before because everyone understood there was still more truth waiting patiently on paper. Robert carefully slid the final folder onto the table without changing his expression. The tab across the top read Lifestyle Expenses. Such an ordinary phrase for something that carried the weight of 15 years. Everything in this section has already been verified through bank statements, payment confirmations, and tax documentation, he said. If anyone wishes to review the original records later, they are available. Melissa forced another smile, but it looked fragile now. You are making this sound much more dramatic than it is. Robert inclined his head politely. I have no interest in drama. Mrs. Carter, only accuracy. He opened the folder and removed the first statement. The down payment for your current Lexus sport utility vehicle was transferred from Mr. Carter's business account 4 years ago. Another page followed. Monthly vehicle payments were also drafted from the same account until the loan was satisfied. Melissa frowned. I thought those payments came from our household budget. Robert answered with quiet certainty. Your household budget received regular transfers from Mr. Carter's consulting income whenever additional funds were required. He reached for another document. The anniversary vacation in Maui 6 years ago. Airfare for both travelers. Hotel accommodations. Rental vehicle. Dining expenses. All paid through Mr. Carter's American Express business account. I remembered that trip more clearly than the paperwork ever could. Melissa had stood barefoot on the beach one evening watching the sunset over the Pacific and thanked me for believing in her career. She had promised we would always be partners, no matter who earned more in any particular year. Standing in that ballroom now, I wondered when those words had stopped meaning anything to her. Robert continued reading with the same measured pace. Professional wardrobe reimbursements before Mrs. Carter's executive promotion, covered through transfers authorized by Mr. Carter. Conference travel expenses not reimbursed by her employer, covered by Mr. Carter. Membership fees for executive networking organizations, covered by Mr. Carter. The vice president from Melissa's company slowly cleared his throat. He looked genuinely confused. Melissa, he said carefully, I thought you always said you built your career completely on your own. She turned toward him quickly. I did. I worked hard for everything I achieved. I spoke for the first time in several minutes. Nobody here has questioned your work ethic. Every eye shifted toward me. You earned your promotions. You earned your position. I have always believed that. The only thing I never understood was why my support eventually disappeared from the story. Melissa looked at me as though she had never heard that question before. Perhaps she had not. For years I had swallowed every uncomfortable moment because I believed marriage required patience. Somewhere along the way, patience had quietly become permission. Robert placed another page on top of the growing stack. There is one additional category worth mentioning. He adjusted his glasses before reading. 3 years ago, Mrs. Carter accepted a senior executive position requiring relocation discussions and extensive travel during the first 12 months. During that period, Mr. Carter reduced his own client schedule by approximately 30%. Melissa stared at him. Why would that matter? Robert answered without hesitation. Because the reduction lowered his annual income by nearly $400,000 while allowing him to manage household responsibilities, coordinate travel arrangements, maintain the residence, and provide flexibility for your career transition. The silence that followed felt almost physical. I remembered declining several lucrative contracts because Melissa's new role demanded unpredictable hours. I had never regretted that decision. Watching someone you love chase a dream never feels like a sacrifice when you believe you are building the same future. What I regretted was allowing that history to disappear without ever correcting it. Melissa's mother slowly covered her mouth with one hand. Harold lowered his eyes toward the table. Even the guests who barely knew us now seemed uncomfortable, as though they had wandered into a private conversation they were never meant to hear. Melissa finally looked directly at me. "Why did you never tell anyone?" she asked softly. I held her gaze. "Because I thought protecting your reputation was part of loving you." She blinked several times, but no words came. Robert quietly closed the final folder before speaking one last time. "There is only one document remaining." He rested his hand on a sealed envelope that had remained untouched inside the portfolio from the moment he arrived. Unlike everything else presented tonight, this document was never intended for public discussion. Mr. Carter instructed me to keep it confidential unless his financial integrity was publicly challenged. Every person at the table looked toward the envelope. Melissa followed their eyes, her confidence fading into uncertainty. "What is in it?" she asked. Robert did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me and waited. I took one slow breath, nodded once, and watched him break the seal. Robert unfolded the single sheet inside the sealed envelope with the same care a historian might use when handling an old document. Unlike the bank statements and payment records, this page carried only a few paragraphs, a signature, and a notary seal. He looked at me one last time before speaking. This document was prepared 2 years ago after Mr. Carter requested an independent review of all household finances. His instructions were very specific. It would remain confidential unless false public claims damaged his financial reputation. Melissa stared at the envelope as though she could somehow change its contents by refusing to believe they existed. "Read it," I said quietly. Robert nodded. "The independent review concludes that between the date of marriage and the completion of this report, approximately 87% of all long-term household obligations were funded directly or indirectly through income generated by Mr. Daniel Carter. The remaining expenses were paid through Mrs. Melissa Carter's employment income or the joint household account." Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a drink. Even the soft music drifting through the ballroom suddenly felt very far away. Robert continued. "The review also confirms that transfers from Mr. Carter's consulting firm into the joint account were intentionally structured to appear as ordinary household deposits rather than personal contributions. This arrangement was requested by Mr. Carter for privacy reasons and to simplify tax planning." Melissa slowly shook her head. "No, that cannot be right." Robert calmly placed another page beside the report. "This schedule contains every transfer over the past 15 years. I watched her eyes scan line after line of dates, amounts, and account numbers. Some transfers were modest. Others were substantial. Together they told a story that had never required words until tonight. Melissa looked up at me with confusion replacing certainty. "Why would you hide all of this?" she whispered. I answered honestly. "Because I never wanted our marriage to become a competition." She lowered her eyes again. I remembered the first year my consulting business became successful. I had suggested buying a larger house. Melissa worried people would assume she could not contribute equally. So I quietly arranged the financing through my business and told her we would simply make decisions together. Later, when promotions increased her salary, I celebrated every achievement without mentioning that my company still covered most of our long-term expenses. It never felt important. Love was supposed to make accounting unnecessary. Somewhere along the road, silence stopped protecting our relationship and started rewriting it. Melissa's vice president leaned forward carefully. "Melissa," he asked, "did you know any of this?" She answered without looking at him. "I knew Daniel's business did well sometimes. Her voice sounded smaller than it had only minutes earlier. I thought. She stopped before finishing the sentence because there was nothing left to complete. Assumptions collapse quickly when they meet evidence. Harold cleared his throat and looked directly at me. Son, why did you pay for Linda's insurance after I retired? I smiled faintly. Because you spent your whole life taking care of your family. I thought someone should make sure you could enjoy retirement without worrying about medical bills. Harold removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Linda reached for his hand beneath the table. Across the room, several guests who had laughed earlier now avoided looking at me altogether. Embarrassment has a way of changing direction once the truth arrives. Robert closed the report and rested both hands on the portfolio. There is one final clarification. Melissa looked up slowly. During the preparation of this review, I asked Mr. Carter whether he wished to document his personal contributions publicly. He declined. His exact response was recorded in my notes. Robert opened a small notebook and found the page. He said, "If my wife succeeds, people should congratulate her. They do not need to know what happened behind the scenes. That belongs to us." The room fell completely silent. I had forgotten saying those words until Robert repeated them. Hearing them now felt like listening to someone I barely recognized. Melissa covered her mouth with trembling fingers. For the first time all evening, there was no executive confidence, no polished smile, and no carefully rehearsed explanation. There was only a woman sitting in the middle of a room full of witnesses, slowly realizing that the person she had spent years diminishing had been protecting her dignity long after she had stopped protecting his. I reached for my untouched glass of water, took a slow sip, and gently set it back on the table. Then I looked at Robert and asked one quiet question. "Did you also bring the correspondence file?" Robert gave a single nod and reached beneath the stack of financial records until he found a thin gray folder that looked almost ordinary compared to everything else on the table. "Yes," he replied. "I brought the correspondence file because you instructed me to preserve every written communication connected to the financial review." Melissa stared at the folder with visible uncertainty. "Correspondence?" she asked quietly. "What correspondence?" Robert opened the folder and carefully removed several printed emails arranged in chronological order. "These are not private conversations between husband and wife," he explained. "These are professional communications between my office and Mr. Carter regarding financial planning, documentation requests, and instructions concerning the privacy of household finances." He paused before lifting the first page. "I believe one message is especially relevant tonight." He adjusted his glasses and began reading. From Daniel Carter to Robert Whitman, dated April 14th, 2 years ago. Subject, Household Financial Review. "Robert, please complete the independent report, but keep everything confidential. Melissa has worked incredibly hard to build her career. I never want anyone thinking she succeeded because of my income. If people choose to believe she supports me instead, let them. My reputation will recover from a misunderstanding. Her confidence might not recover from public embarrassment." Robert lowered the page. No one spoke. I had almost forgotten writing those words late one evening after finishing a client meeting. At the time they felt obvious. Marriage meant protecting each other even when nobody noticed. Melissa slowly lowered herself into the nearest chair as though her knees no longer trusted the floor beneath them. Her eyes remained fixed on the printed email. "You wrote that?" she asked. I nodded once. "Yes." She swallowed carefully. "Even after I joked about you at work?" I answered honestly. "Especially after that." I remembered the first company holiday party where she introduced me as the husband who had plenty of free afternoons. Everyone laughed. On the drive home she apologized and said she only wanted to fit in with executives who measured success by visible careers and impressive job titles. I believed her. Then the jokes continued. Different audience. Different year. Same story. Each time I convinced myself it would be the last. Robert selected another document. Several months later, I asked Mr. Carter whether the report should be updated to reflect additional financial contributions. He glanced toward me before reading the response. "No update is necessary. I would rather Melissa be respected for her accomplishments than have anyone compare our incomes. Please continue handling transfers exactly as before." Melissa covered her eyes for a moment. The room remained completely silent except for the faint hum of the ballroom air conditioning. Even the staff had quietly stepped back, sensing that this evening had become something entirely different from a celebration. Her vice president shifted uneasily before looking at me. "Daniel," he said, "I have known Melissa for almost 7 years. She always spoke about carrying everything herself. Why did you never correct anyone?" I looked around the room before answering. Because every correction would have embarrassed my wife. I believe protecting our marriage was more important than protecting my image. I smiled faintly. Apparently, I was protecting only one side of it. Nobody argued with that. Harold leaned forward, resting both hands on the table. "Son," he said softly, "I owe you an apology." I gently shook my head. "No, sir." He looked confused. "Why not?" I answered. "Because you believe the story you were told. That is different from choosing to invent one." Melissa closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them again, they looked tired in a way I had never seen before. "Daniel," she whispered, "I honestly thought." She stopped once more, unable to finish. I did not rescue the sentence. Some realizations have to arrive on their own. Robert quietly placed the printed emails back into the folder before speaking again. "There is one final item connected to these communications." He removed a sealed business envelope with my consulting firm's letterhead. "This was delivered to my office last week with instructions that it remain unopened unless Mr. Carter specifically requested it during tonight's gathering." Melissa looked toward me with growing concern. "What is that?" she asked. I rested my hand on the envelope without opening it immediately. "It is not another financial record," I said. "It is simply a decision I hoped I would never have to make." Every face around the table turned toward the envelope. The laughter that had filled the ballroom less than an hour earlier had completely disappeared. In its place remained only quiet anticipation, the uncomfortable kind that arrives when everyone realizes the numbers were never the real ending of the story. They were only the beginning. My fingers rested on the envelope for several seconds before I finally broke the seal. The paper inside was surprisingly thin. After everything Robert had revealed that evening, anyone expecting another stack of financial records would have been disappointed. There were only 2 pages. One was addressed to me. The other carried my signature at the bottom, but had never been delivered. Melissa watched every movement without saying a word. I unfolded the first page and quietly handed it to Robert. "Please read it." He looked at me as though making certain I was absolutely sure. I gave him a slight nod. "This letter was prepared by Mr. Carter 6 months ago," Robert began. "He asked my office to hold it unless he personally requested its release." He looked down and continued reading. "If you are hearing this letter, it means something I feared has finally happened. It means protecting my wife's reputation was no longer enough to protect our marriage. If that day comes, I do not want revenge. I only want the truth to stand where I stood for years." A long silence settled over the ballroom before Robert continued. "I have never cared who earned the larger paycheck. I cared that we built a life together. I believed every mortgage payment, every tuition check, every late night at work, every canceled vacation, and every business opportunity one declined would become part of the story we would someday tell our grandchildren. Instead, those moments slowly disappeared until I became a guest inside my own marriage." Melissa lowered her head. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she made no effort to interrupt. Robert continued reading with the same calm voice. "If Melissa ever reads this, I hope she understands something I never found the courage to say out loud. I was never hurt because she became successful. I was proud of her every single day. I was hurt because somewhere along the road, she stopped seeing me as the man standing beside her and started introducing me as the man standing behind her." Nobody around the table moved. Even guests sitting farther away had quietly turned their chairs toward us. A celebration had become a room full of witnesses listening to a husband describe years of invisible disappointment without raising his voice once. Robert reached the final paragraph. "If this letter becomes necessary, then my silence has already failed. I hope nobody leaves tonight believing one person built our marriage alone. Success is rarely a solo performance. Somebody usually wakes up earlier, stays up later, carries burdens nobody applauds, and quietly chooses love over recognition. I was grateful to be that person. I only wish my wife had remembered." Robert folded the letter and carefully placed it back on the table. Melissa covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders trembled as she struggled to steady her breathing. When she finally looked up at me, her voice barely carried across the table. "Daniel, I never realized I answered gently. I believe that now. She blinked with confusion. You believe me? I nodded. Yes. I believe you convinced yourself the story was harmless because everyone laughed. After enough years, even you forgot where the joke ended and the truth began. She wiped her eyes slowly. I thought people respected confidence. I smiled sadly. They do. But confidence never needed my dignity as payment. Her vice president leaned back in his chair and quietly exhaled. Daniel, he said, I owe you an apology as well. I laughed tonight. I looked toward him. You laughed because someone invited you to laugh. That is how crowds work. He lowered his eyes. Still, I should have known better. Around the room, several guests quietly nodded, each recognizing their own place in the evening. Harold stood from his chair and walked around the table until he stopped beside me. He rested one hand gently on my shoulder. I spent years believing my daughter carried this family, he said. Tonight, I discovered she carried the spotlight while you carried the foundation. I looked up at him and offered a small smile. Foundations are supposed to stay underground. Harold shook his head slowly. Only until someone forgets they exist. Melissa looked at me again, her expression no longer defensive, no longer proud, only deeply tired. Can we please go home and talk? She whispered. I looked at the anniversary decorations, the untouched cake, the flowers, the guests who had arrived expecting speeches and laughter, and then back at the woman I had spent 15 years trying to protect. I took one slow breath before lifting the second page from the envelope, the one bearing my own signature, and quietly slid it across the table toward her. Melissa looked down at the page I had placed in front of her as though she already knew it would change everything. She did not touch it immediately. Instead, she searched my face one more time, perhaps hoping she would find anger because anger can sometimes be negotiated. Calm cannot. Finally, she lifted the document with both hands. Her eyes moved slowly across the first paragraph before stopping completely. This is a legal separation agreement, she whispered. Nobody around the table reacted with surprise. Somehow the room had sensed this moment long before the paper appeared. I folded my hands in front of me and answered quietly. It is only a draft. It has never been filed. I asked my attorney to prepare it 4 months ago. Melissa looked up quickly. For months. I nodded. The night you introduced me to your executive team as the man who had all the time in the world because you paid for everything. She closed her eyes for a moment. I remembered that evening with painful clarity. We had driven home through light rain, the windshield reflecting downtown lights across the glass. She had laughed about how well everyone liked her speech. I had asked whether she really believed the story she told. She smiled and squeezed my hand before saying, Daniel, people love confidence. It was only a joke. I never argued again after that night. Instead, I called my attorney the following morning and asked him to prepare documents I prayed would never leave his office. Melissa continued reading. The agreement contained no dramatic demands, no punishment, no attempt to embarrass her. Our assets would be divided according to the law. Our charitable foundation would continue operating. The retirement accounts would remain untouched until every legal requirement had been completed. Even the language itself sounded calm. Robert had reviewed every financial schedule attached to it months earlier. Nothing about the document had been written out of anger. It had been written out of acceptance. Melissa reached the final page and stared at my signature for several long seconds. You already signed it, she said softly. Yes, I replied. I signed it the same day it was prepared. She looked almost frightened. Then why did you stay? That question deserved an honest answer. Because every morning I hoped I had misunderstood who you were becoming. I paused before continuing. I kept believing. The woman I married would eventually come back. Tears rolled quietly down her cheeks. Daniel, I am still here. I gently shook my head. Part of you is. That is why this hurts. Harold slowly returned to his seat without speaking. Linda reached across the table and quietly covered Melissa's hand with her own. Nobody tried to defend her anymore. Nobody tried to defend me either. The evening had moved beyond choosing sides. It had become something much simpler. Truth rarely needs supporters once it has been seen. Melissa carefully folded the separation agreement and slid it back toward me. Please do not file it, she whispered. I know I cannot erase tonight. I know I cannot erase the last few years. But please let me try to fix what I broke. I looked at the anniversary cake waiting untouched beneath its glass cover. 15 candles decorated the top, still unlit because the celebration had never reached that moment. I remembered every anniversary before this one. The tiny apartment where we shared takeout because we could not afford a restaurant. The 5th anniversary when we drove 3 hours simply to watch autumn leaves change color. The 10th anniversary when we promised we would never let success become more important than kindness. Promises do not disappear all at once. They fade one compromise at a time. Robert quietly gathered the folders into neat stacks without interrupting the silence. His work had always been finished when the numbers stopped speaking. This part belonged to us alone. Melissa reached across the table with hesitant fingers before stopping halfway, uncertain whether she still had the right to touch my hand. I noticed the hesitation more than the gesture itself. Confidence had carried her through the evening. Humility had finally arrived. I was embarrassed, she admitted. Everyone at work talked about husbands with impressive titles and public recognition. Your business was private. You never talked about money. I convinced myself that making jokes about you somehow made me fit in. I listened without interrupting. Then people started believing it, she continued. After a while, I started believing it too. I slowly nodded. That is the danger of repeating a lie. Eventually it stops sounding like one. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Outside the tall windows, the lights reflecting across the Chicago River shimmered in the darkness, steady and unchanged. While inside the room, every certainty we had carried for years had quietly fallen apart. I picked up the unsigned copy of the agreement, looked at it for a long moment, and instead of placing it back inside the envelope, I folded it once and slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket. The ballroom remained quiet long after I slipped the folded agreement into my jacket. Nobody seemed interested in the anniversary cake anymore. The flowers still filled the room with their fragrance. The candles still waited to be lit, and the skyline beyond the windows looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Funny how the world keeps moving even when your own life changes direction. Melissa slowly stood from her chair and looked around at the friends, co-workers, and family members who had witnessed everything. The confidence she had carried into the room had disappeared. In its place stood someone who finally understood the cost of careless words. She turned toward everyone and took a slow breath. I owe all of you an apology, she said. Not because tonight was embarrassing, but because I helped create a story that was never true. Nobody interrupted her. Daniel never lived off me. If anything, I built my success on a foundation he quietly protected for years. Every promotion I celebrated, every opportunity one accepted, every risk I took became possible because he was carrying responsibilities I stopped noticing. Somewhere along the way, I confused being admired with being honest. That mistake belongs to me. She looked at me with tears still resting in her eyes. I spent years asking people to respect my career while quietly taking away the respect my husband deserved. Harold stood and wrapped one arm around his daughter without speaking. Linda quietly wiped her own eyes. Melissa's vice president stepped forward next. Daniel, he said, extending his hand. I cannot change what happened tonight, but I can change what I say. Tomorrow. The story ends here. I shook his hand once. That is all I could ever ask. One by one, several guests approached. Some apologized for laughing. Others admitted they had repeated the same jokes after hearing them so many times. I accepted every apology without anger because I had learned something important during the past few years. Most people do not create lies. They simply repeat the ones they hear most often. Robert quietly closed his portfolio and stood beside me. My work here is finished, he said with his usual calm smile. I hope I never have to bring those folders to another anniversary. I smiled for the first time that evening. So do I. He shook my hand and quietly left the ballroom without waiting for recognition. That was Robert. He had spent an entire career proving that truth never needed dramatic entrances. It only needed accurate records and enough patience to let them speak. After most of the guests drifted into smaller conversations, Melissa and I found ourselves standing near the large windows overlooking the river. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, she broke the silence. Will you ever trust me again? I watched the reflections of city lights ripple across the water before answering. Trust is not rebuilt by one conversation. It is rebuilt by many ordinary days where words and actions finally agree with each other. She nodded slowly. Then I will spend as many ordinary days as it takes. I looked at her carefully. For the first time in years, I believe she understood what ordinary really meant. It was never the vacations, the promotions, the titles, or the applause. It was the quiet mornings, the shared burdens, the unseen sacrifices, and the simple choice to protect each other when nobody else was watching. Whether our marriage would survive, I honestly did not know. Some damage heals. Some damage leaves permanent marks. Only time would decide which one belonged to us. I reached into my jacket, removed the folded separation agreement, and held it for a moment before placing it back inside the envelope. I did not tear it apart. I did not throw it away. Hope is not the same as forgetting. Some reminders deserve to remain close until they are no longer necessary. Melissa watched silently as I sealed the envelope again. "What happens now?" she asked. I offered the only answer I knew was true. Tomorrow begins the same way every real change begins. Quietly, we walked toward the ballroom exit together without holding hands, but also without walking apart. Behind us, the untouched anniversary cake remained exactly where it had been all evening, a celebration interrupted before it ever truly began. Ahead of us waited something far less glamorous and far more valuable. The difficult work of rebuilding honesty one conversation at a time. I learned that night that money can pay for houses, vacations, cars, and elegant celebrations, but it cannot purchase respect once it has been given away. Respect grows through quiet consistency, disappears through repeated carelessness, and returns only when truth is finally allowed to speak. Every dollar I earned had helped build our life, but it was never the most valuable thing I contributed. The greatest investment I ever made was believing in someone else's future without asking for applause. If there was one lesson worth carrying beyond that ballroom, it was this. The strongest people are not always the ones whose names receive the loudest cheers. Sometimes they are simply the ones who keep showing up, keep carrying the weight, and keep choosing integrity long after nobody notices they are doing it.